Imagine walking into your own anniversary party, the one you spent weeks planning down to every detail, only to find your husband with his tongue down your best friend's throat in the coat closet. Not a quick peck, not an accident, a full-on, hands everywhere, clearly not the first time moment. And here's the kicker: when they finally noticed you standing there, frozen in the doorway, your husband didn't apologize. He didn't panic. He looked you dead in the eye and said, "We need to talk about our arrangement." What arrangement? The one where you had no idea you were apparently in an open marriage. Yeah. This story is absolutely wild, and I promise you, the way this woman handled what came next is nothing short of legendary. Buckle up, because we're about to dive into betrayal, revenge, and the most satisfying karma I've seen in a long time. Welcome to Unfiltered Stories, where we dive deep into the most jaw-dropping, unbelievable, and sometimes completely unhinged real-life relationship dramas from across the internet. I'm your host, and today we're looking at a story that honestly left me speechless when I first read it. This comes from Reddit, and let me tell you, the twists in this one just keep coming. Before we get started, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we post these deep dives regularly, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. We've got stories about secret families, wedding disasters, inheritance battles, and so much more. And for those of you who have been here since the beginning, thank you. Your comments, your perspectives, your stories, they make this community what it is. Now, quick content note before we begin. This story involves infidelity, betrayal, and some pretty heavy emotional manipulation. So if those topics are difficult for you, maybe save this one for when you're in the right headspace. Everyone good? All right, let's get into it. We're going to hear the full story, break down what happened, analyze the red flags that were missed, look at the community's reaction, and I definitely want to hear what you all think about this situation because honestly, the moral lines here are blurrier than you might expect. So grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's dissect this absolute mess together. Our story centers on a woman, we'll call her Sarah, who was 34 years old when this all went down. She'd been married to her husband, let's call him Mark, for almost 10 years. They'd been together for 12 years total, having met in their early 20s at a mutual friend's barbecue. By all accounts, theirs was a whirlwind romance. Mark was charming, successful, worked in finance, and had this way of making Sarah feel like she was the only person in the room. They got engaged after a year, married a year after that, and settled into what Sarah describes as a comfortable, stable life in a nice suburb about 30 minutes outside the city. They had a beautiful home, a 4-bedroom colonial with a big backyard, perfect for the kids they'd always talked about having but somehow never got around to. Sarah worked as a graphic designer from home, which gave her flexibility, but also, as she admits now, maybe a bit too much time alone with her thoughts. Mark traveled occasionally for work, nothing excessive, maybe once a month for a few days at a time. Their social life revolved around a core group of friends they'd accumulated over the years, couples mostly, the kind of people you do game nights with and take beach vacations with every summer. And then there was Jessica. Jessica had been Sarah's best friend since college. They'd been roommates sophomore year, stayed close through all the major life events, breakups, graduations, Sarah's wedding where Jessica was the maid of honor. Jessica was single, or perpetually dating as she called it, never quite finding the right person but always optimistic about it. She worked in marketing, was outgoing and vivacious, the kind of friend who'd show up at your door with wine when you'd had a bad day. Sarah trusted her completely. Jessica was family. Here's what's important to understand about Sarah's life at this point. From the outside, everything looked perfect. And from the inside, Sarah thought it was pretty good too. Sure, she and Mark had fallen into a bit of a routine. The spark wasn't quite as intense as it had been in the early days, but isn't that normal after a decade together? They still had date nights, they laughed together, they were planning a big trip to Italy for their 10th anniversary. There were no major fights, no obvious problems. Life was just life, comfortable, predictable, safe. Now, let me ask you something before we go further. Do you think comfort in a relationship is a good thing or a warning sign? Like, when you stop having those butterflies, when everything feels routine and predictable, is that maturity and stability, or is that the beginning of the end? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious what you all think about this. I've heard arguments on both sides, and I think it probably depends on the couple, but I want to hear your take. So Sarah decided to throw a 10th anniversary party. Not just a dinner with a few friends, but a real party. She rented out a private room at a nice restaurant, invited about 40 people, friends, some of Mark's colleagues, some of her clients she'd become friendly with, family. She spent weeks planning it. Custom invitations, a photo slideshow of their relationship, a signature cocktail named after them. She even bought a new dress, this gorgeous emerald green number that made her feel beautiful and confident. Mark seemed excited about it too, or so she thought. He helped with the guest list, insisted they invite Jessica, obviously, talked about how lucky he was to have Sarah. The party was on a Saturday night in late September. Beautiful weather, that perfect early fall evening where you can still be outside without a jacket, but there's just a hint of crispness in the air. Sarah arrived early to make sure everything was set up perfectly. Mark said he'd come straight from the gym, said he wanted to squeeze in a workout before the party. Looking back, Sarah realizes now that was probably a lie, but at the time she didn't think twice about it. Guests started arriving around 7. The energy was great. People were laughing, drinking, telling embarrassing stories about Sarah and Mark from over the years. Jessica showed up looking stunning as always, gave Sarah a huge hug, complimented her dress, handed over a beautifully wrapped gift. Everything was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Sarah remembers thinking at one point in the evening, standing there watching Mark chat with their friends, feeling this overwhelming sense of gratitude. This was her life. These were her people. She was so lucky. Around 9 o'clock, Sarah realized she hadn't seen Mark in a bit. Not unusual at a party, right? People mingle, they move around. She'd been caught up in conversation with some of her college friends who'd driven in for the occasion. She figured Mark was probably outside with the guys, maybe smoking a cigar even though he'd supposedly quit, or maybe in the bathroom. But then 10 minutes passed, then 15, and she started to wonder. She asked around. No one had seen him recently. One of his work friends thought maybe he'd stepped outside to take a call. That's when Sarah's friend Emma mentioned that she hadn't seen Jessica in a while either, and Sarah felt this weird little twist in her stomach. Not panic, not suspicion really, just this odd feeling. She brushed it off. That was ridiculous. But then she thought, you know what, let me just check on Mark, make sure he's okay. The restaurant had a coat closet near the private room entrance, and as Sarah walked past it, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. And she heard something. A sound. A quiet laugh, breathy and low. A woman's voice saying something she couldn't quite make out. Here's where I need you to imagine this moment with me. Sarah stops. She's not thinking anything bad yet. Maybe someone's making a phone call in private. Maybe someone's looking for their jacket. She pushes the door open a bit more, and the image that greets her is one that she says is burned into her brain forever. Mark, her husband, pressed up against the back wall of the closet, his hands tangled in Jessica's hair. Jessica's legs literally wrapped around his waist. They were going at it like teenagers, completely oblivious to the world around them, coats falling off hangers around them. Sarah stood there. She doesn't know for how long. She describes it as time doing this weird thing where it felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Her brain trying to process what her eyes were seeing, trying to make it make sense. There has to be an explanation. This isn't what it looks like. But then they noticed her. Jessica saw her first, and her eyes went wide. She unwrapped her legs, tried to step away, but there wasn't much room in the closet. Mark turned around, and here's the part that Sarah says hurt almost as much as the discovery itself. He didn't look panicked. He didn't look guilty. He looked annoyed. Annoyed that she'd interrupted them. Now pause right here. What would you do in this exact moment? Would you scream, cry, confront them right there, walk away? I want you to really think about it because it's easy to say what you do when you're not in the situation, but when you're actually there, when your entire world is crashing down around you, instinct takes over. Drop a comment and tell me, fight, flight, or freeze. Sarah says she just stared at them, couldn't form words, couldn't move. And then Mark, this is what kills me. Mark straightened his shirt, ran a hand through his hair and said, I kid you not, he said, Sarah, let's not make a scene. We can talk about this later. As if she was the one being unreasonable. As if she was the problem in this scenario. Jessica at least had the decency to look mortified. She started stammering, Sarah, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean for this isn't, we didn't plan. But Sarah wasn't listening to her. She was focused on Mark, on her husband, who still hadn't apologized, who looked like he was waiting for her to just quietly close the door and let them finish. And then he said the line I mentioned at the beginning, the line that made Sarah's blood run cold. We need to talk about our arrangement. Sarah managed to whisper, "What arrangement?" And Mark, with the audacity of someone who truly believes they've done nothing wrong, said, "Come on, Sarah, you had to know, you're not stupid." She had to know? Know what exactly? That her husband was having an affair with her best friend? That apparently everyone knew except her? That their marriage was some kind of open situation she'd never agreed to? Sarah backed away from the closet. She could hear the party continuing behind her, people laughing, music playing, completely unaware that the guest of honor's life was imploding. Jessica tried to follow her, reaching out, but Sarah held up a hand. She said, "And I think this shows incredible restraint," she said. Don't you dare touch me, don't follow me, don't speak to me." Her voice was shaking, but it was clear. And then she turned to Mark and said, "You want to talk, fine, but not here. Not at our anniversary party, that I plan to celebrate a marriage that apparently doesn't exist." Here's what Sarah did next, and honestly, this is where her strength starts to show. She went back into the party. She took a minute in the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, looked at herself in the mirror, and made a decision. She could either fall apart right then, in front of 40 people, or she could hold it together for a few more hours and deal with this privately. She chose the latter. She walked back into that party, smile plastered on her face, and she played the perfect host for another hour and a half. Can you imagine the strength that takes? To stand there making small talk, cutting your anniversary cake, thanking people for coming, all while your world is shattered. Sarah says it felt like she was watching herself from outside her body, like she was an actress playing a role. Mark had the nerve to come back to the party too, though he mostly stayed on the other side of the room. Jessica grabbed her coat and left without saying goodbye to anyone, which some people commented on later, asking if she was okay. When the last guest finally left, when it was just Sarah and Mark and the restaurant staff cleaning up, Sarah turned to him and said, "Start talking." And what Mark told her over the next hour was so much worse than she'd imagined. This wasn't a recent thing. This wasn't a one-time mistake. Mark and Jessica had been sleeping together for 3 years. 3 years, more than a quarter of Sarah and Mark's marriage. It started, according to Mark, at a New Year's Eve party where Sarah had gone to bed early with a migraine and Mark and Jessica had stayed up drinking. One thing led to another, and it just kept happening. Mark actually tried to justify it. He said that he loved Sarah, that she was his wife and his partner, but that Jessica fulfilled needs that Sarah didn't. He said it wasn't personal, it wasn't about Sarah lacking anything, it was just that people are complex and sometimes one person can't be everything. He actually used the term polyamory, like this was some enlightened situation and not just him being a cheating scumbag. Sarah asked him flat out, "Did you ever plan to tell me?" And he said no. He said he didn't see the point, that it would just hurt her, and as long as she didn't know, what was the harm? Let me just pause here to say, this mentality, this idea that what your partner doesn't know can't hurt them, is such a violation. It's not just about the physical act of cheating. It's about the lying, the gaslighting, the theft of someone's ability to make informed decisions about their own life. Sarah had spent 3 years thinking she was in a monogamous marriage, making life decisions based on that assumption, while Mark was living a completely different reality. That's not protection, that's manipulation. Okay, sorry, I had to get that out. This kind of thing makes me so angry. Sarah asked about Jessica. How could her best friend do this? Mark actually defended Jessica, said it wasn't her fault that he'd pursued her, that Jessica had felt guilty the whole time but they couldn't help their feelings. Sarah asked if there were others. Mark hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything she needed to know. There had been others. Jessica was just the longest-running affair. Sarah sat there listening to her husband casually destroy their entire relationship, and she realized something. She didn't know this man. The person she'd married, the person she'd built a life with, was a stranger. She asked him one more question. Do you want to save this marriage? And Mark had the audacity to say, do you think we can get past this? Like it was up to her to forgive and move forward. Like he was willing to consider staying with her if she could just get over this little hiccup. Sarah looked at him, and she said later that in that moment, something just clicked into place. A clarity she'd never felt before. She said, "No, Mark, we can't." And she walked out of that restaurant, got in her car, and drove home. She didn't cry, not yet. She was still in shock, still processing. When she got home, she went into their bedroom and looked around at their life. The wedding photos on the dresser, the vacation souvenirs on the shelves, Mark's clothes in the closet, and she felt absolutely nothing. That's what she says was the scariest part. Not rage, not sadness, just this void where her feelings should have been. She grabbed a suitcase and started packing Mark's things. T-shirts, jeans, his toiletries. She filled 3 suitcases with his stuff, dragged them to the front porch, and locked the door with the chain lock. Mark came home around 2 in the morning. She heard him try his key, heard him realize the chain was on, heard him knock and call her name. She didn't answer. He called her phone over and over. She didn't pick up. He sent texts. "Sarah, please, let's talk about this. You're being irrational. I know you're upset, but we can work through this. Don't throw away 10 years over a mistake." A mistake. 3 years of systematic lying and betrayal was a mistake. Sarah turned off her phone and finally, alone in her house, let herself fall apart. She cried until she couldn't breathe, angry, gut-wrenching sobs that hurt her chest. She cried for the marriage she thought she had. She cried for the trust that was destroyed. She cried for the friendship she'd lost. And somewhere around 4 in the morning, when she had no tears left, she got up, washed her face, and started planning. Because here's what Sarah realized. Mark had underestimated her. He thought she'd forgive him eventually, that she'd be so afraid of being alone or starting over that she'd take him back. He thought she was weak, and she was about to show him exactly how wrong he was. Before we get into what Sarah did next, let me ask you this. Team Sarah all the way, or do you think she should have at least tried counseling? I know some of you are going to say once a cheater, always a cheater, and some of you might say 10 years is worth fighting for. Where do you fall? Let me know in the comments. And if you're invested in this story, hit that like button so I know you want more content like this. The next morning, Sarah called her mom, told her everything. Her mom was rightfully furious and immediately offered to come stay with her, but Sarah said no. She needed to handle this herself. Then she called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, she did research, read reviews, and found the most aggressive divorce attorney in the area, a woman named Patricia Chen who had a reputation for absolutely destroying unfaithful spouses in court. Sarah booked a consultation for that same afternoon. At the consultation, Sarah laid out everything. Patricia listened, took notes, and then said something that Sarah says changed her entire approach. She said, "You're angry and you have every right to be, but anger makes people sloppy. What you need to be is strategic." So they came up with a plan. Sarah wasn't going to file for divorce immediately. She was going to gather evidence, document everything, build an airtight case. Because here's the thing. Sarah and Mark didn't have a prenup, and they lived in a state where infidelity could actually impact divorce settlements. Patricia advised Sarah to do several things. First, get their financial records in order. Print out bank statements, credit card bills, investment accounts, everything. Second, document the affair. That meant getting evidence of Mark and Jessica's relationship beyond just what Sarah had witnessed. Third, secure her own finances. Open a separate bank account that Mark didn't have access to and start moving money there. Fourth, and this was the hardest part, act normal. Don't let Mark know that she was planning anything. So that's what Sarah did. She let Mark back in the house 2 days later. He came back contrite, apologetic, promising it was over with Jessica, swearing he'd do anything to fix this. And Sarah, playing the role of her life, said she needed time but she was willing to try counseling. Mark was relieved, probably thinking he'd dodged a bullet. They scheduled a counseling appointment. Mark thought they were working on their marriage. Sarah was buying time. Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah became a detective. She installed monitoring software on their home computer that logged everything: emails, messages, browsing history. It wasn't pretty, but it was legal since it was a shared marital asset, and what she found was devastating but useful. Mark hadn't ended things with Jessica, not even close. They were still messaging constantly. In fact, they'd just gotten better at hiding it. Sarah found emails about hotels they'd stayed at, receipts for jewelry Mark had bought Jessica, jewelry Sarah had never received. She found text messages where they laughed about Sarah being clueless, where Jessica called Sarah naive and Mark agreed. That hurt in a way the initial discovery hadn't. To know they'd been mocking her, pitying her, talking about her behind her back. But Sarah channeled that hurt into determination. She screenshotted everything, saved everything to a cloud drive that Mark didn't know about, built a timeline of the affair complete with dates, locations, and financial evidence of money Mark had spent on Jessica. She also started documenting their assets. Turns out Mark had been hiding money. He had a separate savings account Sarah didn't know about with almost $75,000 in it. Money from bonuses he'd told Sarah went to their joint retirement account. She documented that too. The more she dug, the more she found. Her husband wasn't just a cheater, he was a liar and a thief. Meanwhile, she played the perfect wife. She went to counseling sessions where Mark performed his remorse. She cooked dinner. She asked about his day. And Mark, thinking he'd successfully manipulated her back into compliance, got comfortable again. Started staying late at work. Started being vague about his whereabouts. Sarah didn't confront him, she just documented. Jessica tried to reach out multiple times. Texts, emails even showed up at the house once when Mark was at work. Sarah opened the door, looked at her former best friend and said, "You need to leave. If you contact me again, I'll get a restraining order." Jessica tried to explain, to apologize, but Sarah just closed the door in her face. Some people might say Sarah should have heard her out, but I disagree. Jessica didn't deserve Sarah's time or emotional energy. She'd made her choices. After 6 weeks of evidence gathering, Sarah had built a case that Patricia said was one of the strongest she'd seen. They had proof of the affair, proof of financial misconduct, proof that Mark had lied repeatedly in counseling. It was time to move forward. Patricia filed the divorce papers on a Wednesday morning. Mark was served at his office that afternoon. Sarah was home when he called, screaming into the phone about betrayal and how could she do this. She let him yell himself out and then she said, calmly, "Check your email." She'd sent him a zip file. Inside were copies of all the evidence she'd gathered. Every message, every receipt, every screenshot. She said, "You asked if we could get past this. My answer is no. You're going to agree to my terms or I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you are." Mark tried to bluster, said he'd fight her, said she'd get nothing. And Sarah said, "Talk to your lawyer, I'll wait." Mark did talk to a lawyer. And his lawyer, upon seeing the evidence Sarah had, apparently told him he was screwed. Not only would Sarah likely get the house and a significant portion of their assets, but given that Mark had hidden money and spent marital funds on an affair, he could actually face additional penalties. Mark's lawyer advised him to settle. But Mark's ego wouldn't let him. He wanted to fight it out in court. He convinced himself that he could paint Sarah as vindictive, that a judge would see she was being unreasonable. So they went to court. And let me tell you, it did not go well for Mark. The trial took place about 4 months after Sarah filed for divorce. In that time, Mark had tried everything to discredit her. He claimed she was mentally unstable. He claimed she'd been neglecting the marriage. He even tried to say that Sarah had known about his relationship with Jessica and had approved of it, that arrangement he'd mentioned. But Sarah's lawyer destroyed every argument. They had the evidence. They had the timeline. They had Mark's own messages proving he'd been deceptive. The moment that Sarah says made everything worth it was when Patricia put Jessica on the stand. Jessica didn't want to testify, but she'd been subpoenaed. And under oath, she had to admit the length of the affair, admit that Sarah hadn't known, admit that she and Mark had actively hidden it. Mark's lawyer tried to spin it, but the damage was done. The judge, a woman in her 60s who Sarah says looked increasingly disgusted as the trial went on, was not sympathetic to Mark. In the end, Sarah got the house. She got 65% of their joint assets. She got half of that secret savings account Mark had been hiding. She got the car she wanted. Mark was ordered to pay her spousal support for 3 years. It wasn't everything, it never is, but it was enough. Enough for Sarah to start over. Enough to make Mark realize he'd made a catastrophic mistake. But here's my favorite part of this entire story, the aftermath. Remember how Mark worked in finance? Remember how he had all these colleagues and professional connections? Well, turns out, having your infidelity and financial deception laid out in public court records isn't great for your reputation. Word spread through his industry. His company didn't fire him, they couldn't without cause, but Sarah heard through mutual friends that he'd been passed over for a promotion he'd been promised. That partners were wary of working with him, that his professional life had taken a hit. And Jessica lost more than just Sarah's friendship. Turns out, their mutual friend group took sides and most of them chose Sarah. Jessica found herself increasingly isolated, uninvited to events, blocked on social media. Sarah didn't ask people to choose, she didn't have to. People saw what Jessica had done and made their own decisions. Sarah also heard that Jessica and Mark tried to make a real go of it after the divorce, but the relationship fell apart within 6 months. Apparently, when you build a relationship on deception and sneaking around, it doesn't work as well when it's out in the open. Sarah posted an update about a year after the divorce was finalized. She'd sold the house, too many bad memories, and bought a smaller condo in the city. She'd thrown herself into her work, and her client base had actually grown significantly. She'd started therapy, was working through trust issues and trauma, but was in a good place mentally. She'd even started dating again, nothing serious yet, but she was open to it. And most importantly, she said she'd learned to trust herself again. To trust her instincts, to know that she deserved better than what Mark had given her. She said something in that update that really stuck with me. She said, "I spent so long being the kind of person who avoided conflict, who wanted everyone to be happy, who made myself smaller to make others comfortable. Discovering Mark's affair was the worst thing that ever happened to me, but in a weird way, it also saved me, because it forced me to fight for myself in a way I never had before. It taught me that I'm stronger than I thought." And that peace at the expense of my own dignity isn't peace at all. Okay, so that's the story. Absolutely wild from start to finish. But now I want to dig into this a bit deeper because there's so much to unpack here. First, let's talk about red flags. Looking back at Sarah's story, were there warning signs she missed? And I want to be really careful here because I'm not victim blaming. When someone is actively deceiving you, especially someone you love and trust, it's not your fault that you don't see it. But from an educational standpoint, what can we learn? Red flag number 1. Mark's reaction to being caught. He wasn't apologetic or panicked, he was annoyed. That tells you that in his mind, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He'd rationalized his behavior to the point where he genuinely believed he was entitled to his affair. People who respect their partners and their relationships don't react that way. Red flag number 2. The secret finances. This is huge and something everyone should check periodically in their relationships. Financial infidelity often goes hand in hand with romantic infidelity because both involve deception and entitlement. If your partner is hiding money, hiding purchases, being secretive about accounts, that's a major warning sign even outside the context of affairs. Red flag number 3. The slow fade of emotional intimacy. Sarah mentioned they'd fallen into a routine, that the spark had dimmed. Now, that alone isn't a red flag. Many healthy long-term relationships go through phases, but combined with emotional distance, lack of communication, or one partner seeming checked out, it can indicate someone's getting their needs met elsewhere. Red flag number 4. A partner who dismisses your concerns or makes you feel crazy for asking questions. Sarah didn't mention this specifically, but I'd bet money that if she'd ever expressed insecurity or asked questions about Mark's whereabouts, he'd made her feel like she was being paranoid or controlling. That's classic gaslighting. Red flag number 5. The affair partner being someone close to you. This is so violating because it's not just one betrayal, it's 2. And often, the affair partner will actually try to get closer to the betrayed spouse to deflect suspicion. Jessica was Sarah's best friend. She was at their house all the time. She knew intimate details of their marriage. She used all of that information to betray Sarah more effectively. That's calculated and cruel. Now, from a psychological perspective, what Mark did is fascinating in a clinical sense. He'd constructed an entire narrative where he was the good guy, where his affair was justified because of his needs, where Sarah should be grateful he was staying Mar. Why to her while also having someone on the side? This is narcissistic thinking at its core, the belief that your wants supersede everyone else's rights, including the right to make informed decisions about their own lives. And the use of the word arrangement, that was manipulation intended to make Sarah question her own reality. By implying that there was some agreement she'd somehow forgotten or misunderstood, Mark was trying to shift responsibility and make Sarah doubt herself. It's a tactic abusers use frequently. Thankfully, Sarah's clarity in that moment prevented her from falling for it. Let's talk about what Sarah did right, because she handled this masterfully. First, she removed emotion from strategy. Yes, she was devastated, but she didn't let that devastation dictate her actions in a way that would hurt her long-term. She got legal advice immediately. She gathered evidence. She protected herself financially. She played the long game instead of reacting impulsively. Second, she set clear boundaries. She cut Jessica off completely. She didn't give Mark the opportunity to manipulate her with promises and apologies. She knew her worth, and she knew she deserved better. Third, she didn't try to hide what happened. She didn't protect Mark's reputation at the expense of her own healing. When people asked what happened to the marriage, she told them the truth. Not in a vindictive way, but in a factual one. And that truth protected her from people trying to paint her as the bad guy. Is there anything Sarah could have done differently? Honestly, not much. Some people might say she should have confronted them immediately at the party, but I actually think showing restraint and planning was smarter. Public confrontations rarely go well and often make the betrayed party look unhinged, which isn't fair but is reality. Some might say she should have skipped the evidence-gathering phase and just filed immediately, but given how the settlement turned out, taking that time clearly paid off. The only thing I might suggest is that Sarah could have benefited from reaching out to a therapist earlier in the process. She did start therapy, but doing it from the beginning might have helped her process the trauma in real time rather than compartmentalizing. But that's a minor point in the grand scheme of things. So what are the broader lessons here? What can we take away from Sarah's experience? First, trust your gut. If something feels off in your relationship, don't dismiss that feeling. You don't have to act on it immediately, but pay attention to it. Our instincts often pick up on things our conscious mind hasn't processed yet. Second, know your finances. Both partners in a marriage should have full transparency about money, accounts, debts, assets, everything. Financial secrecy is a weapon. Don't give anyone that weapon. Third, the person you marry can become someone you don't know. People change. People hide things. The fact that you've been with someone for years doesn't mean you know everything about them. Stay engaged. Keep communicating. Don't assume. Fourth, betrayal by someone close to you, whether that's a partner, a friend, or family, isn't your fault, but how you respond to it is your power. Sarah could have fallen apart. She could have taken Mark back out of fear or loneliness. She could have believed his lies. Instead, she chose herself. And that's the most important lesson of all. You have to be willing to choose yourself, even when it's terrifying. Fifth, revenge is a dish best served calculated. Sarah didn't slash Mark's tires or post about him on social media or do any of the things someone might do in a moment of rage. She dismantled his life systematically, legally, and thoroughly. And the result was lasting consequences for him rather than fleeting satisfaction for her. And finally, healing isn't linear, but it is possible. Sarah's story doesn't end with her broken and bitter. It ends with her stronger, wiser, and open to love again. That's powerful. That's resilience. Now let's talk about how Reddit reacted to this story, because the comments were intense. The vast majority of people were firmly Team Sarah. Comments like, "This is the most satisfying revenge story I've ever read," and "Op is my hero," and "I want to be Sarah when I grow up" were everywhere. People were particularly impressed with her strategic approach. Lots of comments praising her for not confronting them at the party, for gathering evidence, for playing the long game. There was a subset of people who focused on Jessica, with comments ranging from "Jessica is worse than Mark because she betrayed a friend," to "At least Mark didn't pretend to care about Sarah, but Jessica hugged her at the party knowing what she'd done." The general consensus was that affair partners who are friends of the betrayed spouse are particularly despicable because they have insider knowledge they use to deceive better. Some people questioned why Sarah stayed Ho's 6 weeks to gather evidence, asking if it was dishonest or manipulative. Sarah actually addressed this in comments, saying that she struggled with that decision, but ultimately felt it was necessary to protect herself in the divorce. She pointed out that Mark had spent 3 years lying to her face, so 6 weeks of strategic silence didn't make her the bad guy. Most people agreed with her reasoning. There were a few, very few, people who said Sarah should have tried to work it out, that 10 years was worth fighting for, that everyone makes mistakes. These comments were usually downvoted into oblivion, with other users pointing out that a 3-year affair isn't a mistake, it's a choice made repeatedly over 1,000 days. And then there were the people sharing their own stories. So many people commented about their own experiences with infidelity, with betrayal by friends, with divorce. The thread became this community of people supporting each other, sharing advice, offering solidarity. That's one of the things I love about these Reddit stories. They create connection. They remind people they're not alone. One comment that got a lot of attention was from someone who said, "My ex did something similar and I took him back. Biggest mistake of my life. He cheated again within a year. Sarah, you did the right thing. Once the trust is gone, it's gone." That comment had thousands of upvotes and dozens of replies from people agreeing, people saying they'd had the same experience. It really reinforced the idea that Sarah's decision not to try to salvage the marriage was the right one. The update post got even more engagement. People were thrilled to hear Sarah was doing well. There were comments celebrating her condo purchase, her thriving business, her dating life. Lots of "you deserve the world" and "Mark is somewhere crying into his pillow and I love that for him" type comments. The schadenfreude was real and honestly justified. So we've heard the story, we've analyzed it, we've looked at the community reaction. Now I want to hear from you. What's your take on this entire situation? Do you think Sarah handled it perfectly, or would you have done something differently? Do you think Mark deserved worse, or was the settlement fair? What about Jessica? Does she deserve the same level of blame as Mark, or is the married person always more culpable? Here's a specific question for you. If you were Sarah's friend and you'd somehow found out about Mark and Jessica's affair before Sarah did, would you have told her? Or would you have stayed out of it? I'm genuinely curious because that's a tough position to be in. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And another one, do you think affairs can ever be forgiven? Is there any circumstance under which Sarah should have considered working it out with Mark? Or is a 3-year affair an automatic deal breaker no matter what? I think this is one of those questions where people's personal values really come into play, and I'd love to hear different perspectives. Also, I want to know, team divorce like Sarah or team counseling first? What's your threshold for when a relationship is beyond saving? Let me know in the comments because I think this is such an important conversation to have. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself completely invested in Sarah's journey, please hit that like button. It helps the channel grow and lets me know what kind of content you want to see more of. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Unfiltered Stories because we've got so many more incredible, infuriating, satisfying stories coming your way. I post new videos regularly, and trust me, they're all worth your time. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought. Sarah's story is about betrayal, yes, but more than that, it's about reclaiming your power. It's about the moment you decide that you're worth more than the scraps someone is offering you. It's about choosing the hard path, the uncertain path, because the alternative is betraying yourself. And that's something all of us can learn from, whether we've been through infidelity or not. We all face moments in life where we have to choose between what's comfortable and what's right, between what's easy and what we deserve, between staying in a situation that's killing us slowly or taking a leap into the unknown. Sarah took that leap. And yeah, I'm sure there were days it was terrifying, days she doubted herself, days she wondered if she'd made a mistake, but ultimately she chose herself. And that's always the right choice. So to recap this wild journey, Sarah threw an anniversary party for her 10-year marriage, caught her husband making out with her best friend in a coat closet, discovered they'd been having an affair for 3 years, strategically gathered evidence for 6 weeks while pretending to work on the marriage, filed for divorce with an airtight case, won a settlement that set her up financially, ched her ex-husband's reputation crumble, and came out the other side stronger and happier. That's not just a story. That's a masterclass in handling betrayal with grace and strategy. I hope, Sarah, if you're out there and you somehow see this, I hope you know how many people you've inspired. How many people have read your story and found the courage to leave their own bad situations. How many people see you as proof that life after betrayal is possible, is good even. Thank you for sharing your story. And to everyone watching, thank you for being here. Your comments, your engagement, your stories, they matter. This channel is a community and you're all part of it. So keep commenting, keep sharing your perspectives, keep being honest about the messy, complicated reality of relationships. This has been Unfiltered Stories, where we dive deep into the relationship dramas that make you think, make you feel, and sometimes make you want to throw your phone across the room in frustration at people's terrible decisions. Stay curious, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next file.